Good morning. I know that quite a few of you are watching Celebrity Traitors, which is not a surprise considering it is one of the most popular shows on television at the moment. And in this game, if you are selected to be one of the traitors, then you've got two main jobs. Your first job is to lie and to deceive everyone else in the game to convince them that you're not a traitor, but that you are faithful. And your second job is each night you have to murder one of the faithful players until there are no faithful players left. Now, obviously, it's a game. You don't really murder them, but just they're out of the game. They're eliminated from the game. And those players who get chosen to be the traitors, and particularly those that do really well at it, I wonder how they find it when they get back into normal life. In terms of people ever believing them again. Because they've proved themselves to be really good and really convincing liars. And so even though it's in the context of a game, I wonder whether people really ever trust them again. And in this celebrity version of the traitors, there are a number of people there who are professional actors. It is literally their job to deceive people into thinking they are somebody else. When they're on screen, when they're acting, they are playing a role, trying to convince the audience that they are someone else. And so why would you believe any of the actors that are in The Traitors? 3 times in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus warns his disciples not to be hypocrites. Here in the verse on the screen, it's in the context of giving. Then a little bit later, it's in the context of praying, and then in the context of fasting. And in Jesus' day, hypocrite was simply the Greek word for an actor, for a stage actor. A hypocrite was an actor, someone playing a role up on a stage, playing a part, someone maybe wearing a mask. And Jesus was saying in the Sermon on the Mount that there are those people who they're giving to the poor, but they're not giving to the poor because they're concerned for the poor. They're giving to the poor because they want people to look at them and think, wow, how amazingly generous that person is. Or when they pray, they're not praying to get closer to God. They're praying because they want people to look at them and think, wow, how spiritual that person is. Or when they fast, they want people to be impressed by their devotion to God. And so the things that they're doing on the outside are not a genuine reflection of what is going on the inside. And Jesus says to his disciples, it's really important that we are not hypocrites, that we're not playing a role, that we don't have a mask on all the time. Instead, what people see on the outside should be a true reflection of what is going on the inside. And one of the charges that Amos brings against the people of Israel is that when they came into the temple, they were just acting. What people were seeing them doing and hearing them doing was not a true reflection of what was on the inside. And so they came to the temple, they wore the right clothes, they sang all the right words, they made all the right offerings, they prayed all the right prayers, and yet on the inside they were a million miles away from God. Once they got home, once the weekend was over, the way that they behaved was not at all consistent with God's laws and the kind of life that God desired. And yet they thought that was okay because they looked like good Christians. They went to church, they read their Bibles, they gave to charity. They were looking forward to the day of the Lord because they thought that God was going to bring justice on everyone else and judgment on everyone else, but not on them. It's always easier to point the finger at someone else. And if you look back at Amos chapter 1 and chapter 2, Amos does a brilliant finger-pointing exercise as a way of drawing the people in before executing a knockout blow. Amos is speaking to the people of Israel. And if you look at the opening chapters of Amos, you'll see that he brings 7 words of judgment against 7 different nations. Now, remember that in the Bible, 7 is an important word. Often it's an important number. Often it's the number of completeness. And so what Amos does is he starts up there in the top right, and he points the finger at Damascus, and then he goes bottom left to Gaza, and then he goes to Tyre in the northwest, and then Edom in the southeast. Then he comes east to Ammon, and then to Moab, and then finally, by way of conclusion, number 7, he comes to Judah in the south. And by now, the crowd would have been cheering. God's gone all the way around everyone else, and everyone else is going to be judged and punished, and Amos has now sucked the crowd in. If you were here last week, you will remember that we said that the context, the historical context for the book of Amos is that Israel was going through a time of relative prosperity, relative peace. They were expanding a little bit, and many people within Israel saw that this is evidence of God's blessing. God was blessing them at this time. God was pleased with them. But having sucked his crowd in, Amos then gives an unexpected twist. It turns out that this time 7 is not the end. There is, in fact, a number 8, and the number 8 is Israel themselves. And so if you've got a Bible in front of you and you look at, say, Amos chapter 2 and verses 6 and following, you'll see a list of some of the sins that Israel was guilty of. And if you read through the whole of the book of Amos, it's not that long, but you'll find a catalogue of sins, including things like sexual immorality, including idolatry. But again and again and again, Amos keeps on coming back to the way that the people are treating the poor and the marginalized and the most vulnerable, and how the oppressed have no access to justice. It always seems to be just out of their reach, and how the rich are abusing the poor for their own financial gain, and how the powerful manipulate the justice system so that they can keep on getting away with all the things that they are doing. And the struggle of the poor and the powerless against the rich and the powerful, the struggle for justice, it's basically the storyline for every single John Grisham novel that I have ever read. And you don't need to spend too long watching the news or scrolling through social media or reading the papers to see that this is still the case. That the rich are getting richer, often at the expense of the poor, and the rich and the powerful often seem to be able to escape justice. There is this idea of one rule for them and one rule for everyone else. But an important part of Amos's message and an important part of Jesus' message is don't go pointing the finger at everyone else. We need to look inside our own hearts. If you spend any time reading the Bible, then I don't see how you can come to any other conclusion than that God cares for the poor and the marginalized and the foreigner. And he wants his people, therefore, to care for them too. Jesus warns his followers of the dangers of money and power. He tells us not to store up riches on earth, but to store up treasure in heaven. He says, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. In the parable of the sheep and the goats in Matthew 25, the criteria that the king uses to separate the righteous from the cursed is how they treated the least. Did they feed them when they were hungry? Did they clothe them when they were naked? Did they look after them when they were sick? Did they welcome them when they were a stranger? And because this was close to Jesus' heart, we also see it in the life of the early church, where those who had shared with those who did not. We see it in Paul's writing too. And in his book Dominion, historian Tom Holland claims that we in the West are only where we are now in terms of things like human rights and healthcare and the value and dignity of a human life. We are only where we are now because of Christianity. None of these things in and of themselves are objective truths, and they certainly didn't feature in the Greek Empire or the Roman Empire or the Egyptian Empire or the Babylonian Empire. They are concepts that were introduced by Christians. Tom Holland argues that our Western moral framework is built on Christian foundations. So it was there in the early church. It was also there in the Old Testament. We saw it a few weeks ago when we looked at the book of Ruth and the story of the harvest. We see it in the Old Testament law with things like the day of Jubilee, or the year of Jubilee, where wealth is not supposed to be kind of in the hands of just a few, but it's supposed to be distributed amongst all. And we see it multiple times in the lives of the prophets. In December, we are going to be looking at Micah, who very similar time period to Amos, as you can see. And if you know any verses, I know I did check, I'm going to be preaching on Micah, so I'm not going to say anything that's going to upset any of our preaching team. But if you know any verses from the minor prophets, then you've probably heard this one, Micah 6:8. He has shown you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. And in terms of verses that you may have heard from the minor prophets, there's this one that we read earlier on, Amos chapter 5:24. But let justice roll on like a river, righteousness like a never-failing stream. The title of our sermon today is True Worship. And we very easily fall into the trap of when we think about worship, we think about things that we do in church, particularly singing. And we use, and we've used today, phrases and terms like worship leader and worship group and worship music and let's worship. And we often use those within the context of singing. And so it's very, and that just reinforces this idea that worship is about singing. Now that is part of what it's about, but it's not what it is, it's not all that it is about. And we see from what God says to his people in the book of Amos that God is not interested in any of the stuff that we do on the outside if it is not consistent with what is on the inside, if it's not consistent with a heart that is obedient to God. In fact, Amos goes further and says that God says, I hate it when you go through the motions. One of the points that Jesus makes in the Sermon on the Mount, and that Amos and other of the Old Testament prophets make, is that our faith is not about what we do. You can observe all the religious festivals. You can sing all of the songs. You can give away everything that you own. You can perform miracles. You can even preach the gospel and still totally miss the point. And that's why we need to start at the cross. That's why we need to keep on coming back to the cross. Because God knows things about me that no one else knows. God knows things about you that no one else knows. And yet he still loves us. Jesus still came to the cross to die for us so that we can know forgiveness, so that we can know peace, so that we can know life in all its fullness. Jesus went to the cross because of our sin. And Jesus invites us to follow him. And so my worship is everything that I do in response to what God has already done for me. And the things that I do because I want to be with Jesus and I want to be like Jesus. Some of you will be familiar with the Myers-Briggs personality test, and Sue and I first did this when we were All Nations before we were married, and it will come as no surprise to learn that Sue and I are totally extreme opposites. Sue was an off-the-scale extrovert when she did this, and I was an off-the-scale introvert. I am an ISTJ, and Sue is an ENFP. And we were so extreme that because the person doing the course knew, so Sue did it first, then I did it at a later date. She knew that we were dating, and she actually was so concerned that we were so extreme that she asked to see us both and talk about our relationship. But we've done this in different contexts a number of times since, in various contexts. And I'm still an ISTJ and Sue is still an ENFP, but every time we do the test, we are a little bit more like each other. Because when you spend time with somebody, it changes who you are. You become a little bit more like them. And as I spend time with Jesus, I will become more like Jesus. And so I don't start to care for the poor, and I don't start to become passionate about issues of justice in order to be more like Jesus. No, instead I come to the cross. I start at the cross. I remember God's amazing love for me, his amazing grace that we sang of earlier. And I want to spend time with Jesus. And as I spend time with Jesus, I will become more like Jesus. And as I become more like Jesus, I will start to care for the poor and be passionate about justice. What people see on the outside needs to be a true reflection of the change that the Holy Spirit is bringing about on the inside. My attitudes towards refugees, my attitudes towards to foreigners, my attitudes towards the poor and the marginalized are to be shaped by what the Holy Spirit is doing in me as I spend time with Jesus and as I become more like Jesus. We live in an age of 24/7 news, and because of social media, it's very easy to know what's going on all over the world at any particular point in time. And as a result, it's really easy to become desensitized. We can be watching the news, and the first story can be a terrible story of injustice. The second story can be a terrible story of misery. The third story can be a terrible story of suffering. And the fourth story can be that Tess Daly and Claudia Winkleman are leaving Strictly at the end of the current series. And that is the thing that we're energized by. And the other three stories go straight out of the window. We are much more energized by that final, least important story. We become desensitized to what is going on. Or we see something on social media and we engage with it by liking a post or pressing on a button and filling in a petition, or we repost it ourselves, and that is the extent of our engagement, and we think we've done our bit. And there is so much need in the world that it can be really, really easy to be totally overwhelmed. And because we can't do everything, we end up doing nothing. But we can do something. And so my advice, if you're not already involved in some way with some organization or something that you're interested and passionate about, my advice would be to pray. and to ask God to show you what one thing or two things or maybe three things in all of the things in the world, what one, two or three things does God want you to get involved in? And it will probably be something that you are already passionate about, because God gives us our passions for a reason. And then when God reveals that thing, that one thing, maybe two things, then really get stuck into that. Don't worry about all the other stuff. God will give that to somebody else. Get stuck in to the thing that God is asking you to get stuck into. It might be homelessness. It might be poverty. It might be mental health in young people. It might be the persecuted church. It might be refugees. It might be sponsoring a child. There's all sorts of things it might be, and it will be different for each one of us. And then once God's put that on your heart, find out everything that you can. Join a mailing list. Write a letter to our MP. Pray. Volunteer. Get involved. And I'm rather foolishly going to say, and become a pain in my neck. By which I mean, you are God's put this particular passion on your heart. So become an advocate. Why can't we pray about it? Why can't we talk about it on a Sunday? Can I share? Can we do this? So become a pain in my neck as you stand up for the thing that God has made you passionate about. Let's pray.